I'm Mark Dresner, and this is Forward Focus, a special interview series featuring experts and leaders at the forefront of innovation. Forward Focus is brought to you by FEI, the annual Front End of Innovation Conference, now entering its 13th year. Joining me today is Sam Ford. He is the Director of Audience Engagement at Peppercom and the co-author of Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. Sam, welcome to Forward Focus.
It's a pleasure, Mark. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. When we spoke earlier, you expressed some concern over the extent to which organizations make decisions based on big data nowadays. What's wrong with big data? What are we missing there? What's it leaving out?
Nothing's wrong with data in particular. I think the ability we have to gather data and make decisions based on data can be a very good thing. There are issues about how that data is collected, privacy concerns, that sort of thing. But setting that issue aside for a moment, I think the issue often becomes that we've become so enamored with the amount of data that we collect. We have started to convince ourselves that that data can say everything about the human beings the data is supposed to represent. But two problems occur. One is we spend more time on perfecting the collection of the data than we do interesting insights that could be gleaned from that data. Related to that, we may start to think that data says things it doesn't. We extrapolate its meaning. So as an example, my title is Director of Audience Engagement. Often people will talk about audience engagement through certain types of data. So how long people spend on a certain web page or how many times they've clicked. Well, what that's a measure of is how many times they've clicked or how long their browser stayed on a web page. It doesn't necessarily measure engagement. And we make that sort of slippage where we think we take the indicators and try to say they're explaining something that goes beyond what the data can do. Which gets me the larger concern that I have, which is what's missing from the data, which is what gets boiled out when you reduce people to numbers. Because reducing people to numbers has a great advantage. It's scalable, it's understandable, it's intelligible, you can do something with it, and it sounds so precise and concrete. And I think especially in business, where numbers are the trade we're involved in, so often those numbers sound precise and they sound accurate. But there's a whole lot of messiness about human communication that gets eliminated in the process. And some of that messiness is the context that actually allows you to understand not the market sort of aggregate profile you've built of your audience, but the actual human beings that you're trying to reach.
Well, that's a nice segue into the next question that I had for you, and that was you strongly advocate for organizations to empathize and to listen as opposed to hear to people. Why do you feel so strongly, and what do these terms mean?
So if you go back to their most basic, think of hearing as the physical process that we do as human beings. We physically receive a sound. And companies have become quite good at that. They've invested a lot of time, money, technology, software, engineers, staff, resources around doing it. I like to call a lot of these platforms hearing aids. So we make sure we can collect all of it and we do with it what we can. But what listening is an active process that requires making sense of the sound that's being uttered. And I think we've spent far too little time doing that. So, companies are very good at when are people talking about us? What do they say? And most of the clients I work with, they measure that to the nth degree if they have the research team and budget to do so. What are people saying about us? Is it positive, negative, or neutral? What's our share of voice? These are the questions that are discussed in marketing and communication.
And they've got natural language processing and so forth. So,
absolutely, it's all automated.
Very sophisticated.
And in no way am I saying that is fruitless or a waste of time. There's great value in doing that, but I think we sometimes believe that it says all that can be said or that we can understand everything from that data set. But the data often can't answer why or how, and that's something that I think actively listening to the audience can start to do. But something else that's important when you're thinking about listening is that you're listening for what the audience cares about, talks about, thinks about on their agenda rather than yours, which is when so suddenly starting to pay attention to what people care about in general. And I think knowing a community that you're trying to reach or court is the difference between seeing that community as your audience and instead seeing them as a public that exists outside your company, right? That these are social connections that exist in general. And it's tied to a larger problem, which is we see often customers as individuals rather than socially connected communities of people. And thinking about that network and those contacts involves listening to really get the nuance of it right, to be able to really actively be part of that community and speak to them in a deep way requires the hard work of listening. We live, even for companies that aren't publicly traded, in a very moment-by-moment, market-driven mentality that cause people to have consternation about planning for the future. But it's really dangerous, I think, for a company, which is you only think about something that will give you an immediate ROI. And yet reputation is something that's hard to attach really specific ROI to. We get back to the problem with numbers, which is they offer this sort of precision that messier sorts of qualitative benchmarking cause people stray away from because it's not as hard. Yet it's those things that often are what build relationships with a customer. And I see a lot of companies burn themselves from not taking on the messier work because they want to stay in something that they can report to their higher ups, right? There's a precision in we increased from X to Y, you know, but there's no whys or hows or relationships or understanding that's involved in that, and it focuses on understanding.
That softer side.
Exactly. And
how do we get started? How
does
does an organization get started when they're really looking at because you mentioned culture, which is obviously going to, so maybe it's not an organization. How do individuals in an organization? I'll leave it open for you.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing you can do is start by figuring out an internal culture that allows and encourages, and in some ways at first may sort of force people every day to be able to understand the audience they're trying to reach. I think there's great specific examples that you can find from deep ethnographic work, but what I'm really talking about here is a mindset and a way of thinking, which is sort of know your audience well enough to imagine being various stakeholders, various parts of that audience, and see how they would read. The other thing is, don't forget about surplus audiences, right? Think about not the main intended audience for a message that you send out, but what are those other audiences? So here's a message we're going to send to our shareholders. But in the modern world, digital world, your customers, your employees, other people are going to see that same message, and you don't see companies reading it with the hat of those other audiences on, which is if an employee comes across this communications, which will be publicly available, they may not be our intended audience, but they may well see it because you do a Google search, it doesn't parse out which result you were supposed to see because this all gets meshed together. How do you do that? The other thing is you have all parts of the company creating texts, creating marketing messages or communications messages, and not necessarily coordinating with each other. I think of it from an entertainment standpoint because I study pop culture. It would be like having an entertainment property that's telling each chapter of the story, and the writers of each chapter aren't talking to each other, so the story would make no sense. And that's what I think often happens from an organization is, you are, as the audience, you see a bit here, a bit there. You're trying to put it together and make sense of how it all fits together to tell a common story when the people writing each of those chapters may not even know one another, even though it's all labeled as coming from the same organization. And I think that is, again, looking at marketing and communications from the audience's perspective rather than the company's.
Thanks for giving us a lot to think about, Sam. I appreciate it.
No problem. It's been fun.
Yeah. And that concludes this episode of Forward Focus. I'm Mark Dresner, and if you'd like to know more about FEI, the Front End of Innovation Conference, please visit us online at www.frontendofinnovation.com. Until next time, thanks for joining us.